This is Worldviews in Perspective. I'm Pete Denault along with T. Nash, Chris Stratton, and Lloyd Phillips. A worldview is the fundamental orientation of a society or an individual, encompassing the whole of the individual or society's knowledge and point of view. A worldview can encompass a natural, normative, postulates, or themes, laws, emotions, and ethics. Hi, I'm Pete Denault along with T. Nash and Chris Stratton. We're taking a look at Worldviews in Perspective. The worldview we're examining currently is postmodernism. We left off talking about postmodernism and it as a worldview, looking at the theology of postmodernism, which is atheism. So, T, let's explore this from the point of view of theology and kind of recap where we were and where we left off as far as what atheism is and why is the theology it's so important to the postmodernism look at their worldview.
Postmodernism conceptually looks at religion, or they look at theology. They also look at atheism. You might say that postmodernist is probably has a sense of atheism and agrees with atheism. That's strictly subjective to them. It's not something that they call an overall belief system, because postmodernists do not believe in anything that has an overall universal view. So it's only a subjective thing.
So objectivity, right down to theology, is something for discussion where everything is subjective to my own personal point of view.
Exactly. And that's okay. Postmodernists are okay with that. But if you say there is, let's say from an opposing viewpoint to postmodernists, that there is a God, and they would say that's okay for you, but not for me.
So now let's further get into the nuts and bolts of what atheism as a theology actually is.
Well, it's kind of controversial, because atheism in itself, the definition of atheism, does not believe in any God or gods. It is a rejection of that. So it sets you separate from any statement that there's a supernatural being or a supernatural force or a supernatural energy, whatever that might be. Atheism is that its particular stance. That's its principle.
Now we hear a lot about theology as well, and if you look at other worldviews, they're very theology or theologically related. Looking at theology from other perspectives, there is a God, and you take a look at things such as morality and develop those from a certain perspective.
Part of theology is, of course, that there is a belief that there is a God or gods, and it applies to different worldviews. In a sense, there is Christianity, of course, and then there's Islam, but the gods are different between those two. And cosmic humanism has a definition or an understanding of a God, and that is a little bit complicated, because you hear in cosmic humanism the God is an energy force, or it is a God within you. You are a God yourself.
All right, and when we look at postmodernistic points of view, from a theological standpoint and atheism, we're just basically saying my theology is not necessarily atheistic. My theology is what I believe to be true, and I could steal from other points of view or other worldviews to make that my personal postmodernist look at what is real to me.
Postmodernism does that specifically. Postmodernists most preferably do not agree with theology, in the sense of it has a universal point to it. And that's a little bit difficult to understand. And then just when you look at atheism, there are no gods. that's going to probably fall in line with the overall worldview point to postmodernists when you look at the other aspects of postmodernism. That's just one. We're talking about theology, gods or no gods.
So from a thought perspective, looking at atheism and the worldview of postmodernism, let's take a deeper dive into the thought of where the postmodernist comes to the point of viewing atheism as the proper perspective.
Well, atheism in itself is, in the way that the best explain it that I've seen, that I've come to understand, is that if there are no gods, then what? Once you ask that question, that opens you up to all kinds of different potential various principles and other things that come into play. If there is no God, then what? What is it? What is it?
It's self-reliance?
Self-reliant, yeah, that's people.
Self-actualization?
That's a good point. Self-actualization is very important right now in today's cultural arena.
So how do we view self-actualization and tie that into a community? How does community develop?
Well, community in a postmodernist viewpoint is that, and postmodernism itself kind of anchors itself on this, is that you're culturally designed. You come from a culture, and that community, which could be varied, various different cultures, there are many, many of them. Whatever culture that you're subjected to is going to define you. So self-actualization is part of identity too, and that's a rather recent, in our time, principle that's come about. Self-actualization kind of adapts itself to identity, and identity is wide open now. It's a wide open principle understanding. To talk about that in itself is a pretty big subject. So,
well, we're going to get into identity politics, and we're going to eventually travel down those roads as to that point of view from the postmodernistic viewpoint, or how the world is seen, their worldview, or a worldview of postmodernism. But when we delve down into the atheistic point of view, that becomes very important because it affects things such as individual morality, political points of view, philosophy, so on and so forth.
Yes, atheism itself, that first stance of atheism, kind of sets the stage for your worldview, and all the other categories that you think that are attached to it or what make up a worldview. Atheism stands out as it moves you into naturalism. It moves you into, again, we talk about identity and the understanding of how we're made and creation, or if there is no creation. We get into several different subjects about that. Just by the mere fact that there are no gods, and that's what the question is, if there are no gods, then what? If there's no God, then what? What is there?
Well, if there is no God and you're looking for the answer to then what, that would affect reality.
And reality is a really important subject for postmodernists, because postmodernism doesn't quite adapt itself to reality. It kind of rejects, I guess, the modern thought of what reality is. Postmodernists reject that. They say there is. They kind of go on this principle of, it's called anti-realism. And anti-realism is part of the categories of a principle of a worldview part. It's a part of postmodernism, anti-realism. Well, when you say that, anti-realism, your first thought about that is, well, it's against realism. Well, in a sense, that's partially true, but in a postmodernist viewpoint, looking at anti-realists, and their statement is that there's nothing really true that you see or corresponds to reality. Reality, it's defined by postmodernism. This is complex. This is difficult. It's there is no reality. It's basically what they're saying. What you see is your perception of reality, and what I see is my perception of reality. There's nothing in a sense of what is true that you see. It brings itself to this point again. Postmodernists always do this. It's subject to you. It is subject to your interpretation of it. It's not subject to an overall understanding. And then the perfect example to explain this, and this is really troubling because let's talk about this. Let me give you an example. Yeah, this comes from a book that speaks about postmodernism, and it's really an excellent point. If I tell you that a train is coming down the track, what do you think?
I think the train's not coming.
You think the train's not coming. Okay, well, that's okay. But in a sense, though, to me, the train's coming down the track. And now let's think about the train itself. Can you see the train?
No.
You can't see the train. Well, in my mind, I might see the train. The train's coming down the track. But you interpret it differently, correct? That's what you're doing?
I'm denying the existence of the train.
Well, then you're a good postmodernism because you're basically saying that your viewpoint, it's not coming down the track. Now, the sad thing about that, and here's the complex part of this, is that, guess what? The train's coming down the track, and you might be on the track. Guess what? You better have a sense of reality because the train's coming down the track. You're on the track, and reality's going to definitely take care of the situation.
But I need you to prove that the train's coming down the track.
Just stand on the track and we'll see what happens. I'm sorry I'm laughing, but in a sense it's perception, and it's difficult to take that argument and take it apart. But
So in basis, the theology of atheism leads to an anti-realism philosophy.
I would say, yeah, that's conceptually can be constructed like, yes, you can construct that, yeah, from theology into philosophy into being driven by atheism. Mm-hmm. Now you've got a worldview.
So, T, would you say that atheists ignore physical truth to things? By your statement with the train, with your analogy of the train, would you say that atheists ignore physical evidence of the true existence, then, of anything?
Probably not in the sense of what a true atheist would be, but then from a postmodernist standpoint, he believes in the sense that he's not going to... See, this is where it gets complex. A postmodernist has an atheistic belief that there is no God because they can't believe in a universal, uniform... I guess that's kind of running into this complex question. Atheism in itself is just a sense of it's a belief that there is no God. So we can't pin it on a postmodernist that he doesn't see the train coming. He might see the train coming, but he's subjecting it and he's criticizing it. He's looking at it critically, and that's where he stands. So I would say that that's partially true in itself, partially incorrect.
Well, and not to put bad shade on atheists, but do they not critically think then? Does their belief system prevent them from critical thinking, which is something that is super important, not only to my belief system, but to who I am, problem solving and critical thinking?
I would say that's not an issue. No, an atheist would disagree with you on that statement. No, an atheist would think. It depends upon that.
An atheist thinks, but a postmodernist thinks what they think individually, not as a whole.
Yes, exactly, Peter. That's well said. That's exactly how postmodernists would look at that.
All right, and this is Worldviews in Perspective, Milk Crate Media production. I'm Pete Denault, the host of your show. With us is Worldviews educator T. Nash, Chris Stratton along with us as well as our producer and very integral part of the program. We invite you to view other Milk Crate Media productions and also take a look at 406 Sports. You can download the apps and join Chris for his programming as well. Back with more in a moment.
Did your computer go down? Don't worry, Mike's Print and Copy has computer rentals available until you can get your computer replaced. In addition to computer rentals, Mike's has self-serve copiers so you can take care of your printing needs at your time. Do you have large-scale printing that needs to be done? From high-tech blueprints to large quantities, Mike's Print and Copy is your print store. Stop in and say hi to Mike at their new location at 1605 South Avenue West in Missoula. Mike's Print and Copy, proud sponsors of the Missoula Prep Sports Network.
Have you visited the newest high school sports website in Montana? Go to www.mpsn406.com right now to get up-to-date Missoula Prep Sports schedules, live streaming, and more for all 5 high schools. MPSN406.com is dedicated to promoting and highlighting our local sports heroes and the sports they participate in. Check us out on Facebook and Twitter at MPSN406 or follow us on Instagram by searching for MPSN406. MPSN is Missoula's home for high school sports.
Advertising on the web can be intimidating. Where do you start? What is the most effective way to reach the audience you are targeting? Milk Crate Media can help you reach your audience, whether it is social media marketing or creating a unique commercial for streaming or for radio advertising. Milk Crate Media can help you build a new website or rebuild your existing website that will bring users back again and again. Visit www.mcratemedia.com today. Milk Crate Media is a proud sponsor of Prep Sports in Missoula and the surrounding valley.
Welcome back to Worldviews in Perspective, a Milk Crate Media production. I'm Pete Denault, your host, along with Worldviews educator T. Nash and Chris Stratton, our producer and owner of Milk Crate Media. Happy to have you with us today and happy to be examining postmodernism. And we've gone from the theology of postmodernism, now moving forward, and we talked a little bit about it in the last segment, about what the philosophy is, and the philosophy for postmodernism is anti-realism. Let's examine philosophy a little more closely, T. Define philosophy as you see it from a Worldviews in Perspective educator.
Philosophy itself is defined by its definition as the love of wisdom. And if we all agree that wisdom is important in our lives, we're going to find a way to live our lives, and we're going to look for things that give us security and give us intellectual appreciation. Again, an identity. We're just going to go through that. I think everyone does that. And a worldview is what we end up with, philosophy. And you often hear people, what's your philosophy on this particular point? Or what's your philosophy of life? Meaning, how do you come to the belief that you have that causes you to be the way you are?
Now, you said a very important word. You said wisdom. When we look at wisdom, there's traditional wisdom. There's wisdom of all types. Help me understand the view of wisdom from a postmodernism perspective.
Postmodernism first looks at anything from a critical standpoint. It criticizes it, it looks at it, it's skeptical of anything. Whatever that is, that's the first point of postmodernism. And in order to do that is because I'm going to, if I'm a postmodernist, it's going to be my perception of my life.
Okay, so now let's...
And there's nothing wrong with that. Everyone does that. But we're talking about a worldview. So your worldview itself has its own conceptual makeup. And postmodernists, like a secular humanist, like a cosmic humanist, like a person whose belief system is Christianity, or is a person that believes in Islam, all and has a world viewpoint made of all these different concepts. Postmodernism holds on to concepts, new concepts.
So when we look at the concepts philosophically of wisdom, derived from being wise, we look at certain things, making financial decisions. You do what is wise and prudent, and there are even laws in this country about when you sell financial products, doing what is wise and prudent for the prospective investor. How do we subjectively, from a postmodernist look at what is truly wise and prudent while we're still being critical of what is believed to be wise and prudent?
From what you just stated, and I'm thinking from a postmodernist thought, the way he would look at that, or he or she would look at that, is that I would be skeptical of what you're saying, but I'm going to find agreement with certain things as long as it's subjective to me. And I apply that to myself. It's not universal, it applies to everyone if it works for me.
So the whole philosophy of postmodernism being anti-realism is what works completely and totally subjectively to the individual. It has no bearing on what is real to you from my perspective, what I think and what I believe, and how I subject that point of view and critique that point of view to me is irrelevant to everyone around me.
From your viewpoint, and I'd have to agree with you. But I also have my viewpoint. And my viewpoint and my perception, or whatever that is, or the way I've conceived a thought or conceived anything, is up to me, and that could be different from you, and I have to honor that.
And we're going a little deeper in the weeds than I had intended here, but now let's examine the definition of anti-realism. What is anti-realism?
Anti-realism, the definition that seems to work specifically for this term, anti-realism, is that reality is subjectively constructed by human thought. Reality is subjective, and that's key. You're looking at me a little bit confused. You're in thought. That's difficult to understand. It's because it's like if reality. Let's look at the way that it's been throughout a number of years. Okay, just a number of years historically. There's a theory called the correspondence theory of truth. That reality, if you look, that truth corresponds to reality. That's a correspondence theory of truth. Truth corresponds to reality. So when you think about that reality, I'm looking at you and I see you as a person, and in reality, you're there. Okay, you have a presence. But my mind, from a postmodernist viewpoint, what I'm saying is subject to skepticism. Maybe you're not there. Maybe you're just an illusion. Maybe I should think about that. And maybe I'm not going to conform to the idea that there's 100 people in the room and they all see you. But each one of us has a different perception of what we're seeing about you, and that perception of what we hold, okay, of you is mine. And that's what's important.
So,
And if you think about that and take it further, it has to be that way.
from a construction point of view, as we examine the different disciplines, there are 10 of them for each of these worldviews, that point of anti-realism, that subjective thought, that look at corresponding reality is true for every discipline?
No, because again, going back to this, if we highlighted everything about postmodernism, remember this. This is very important, and it follows through all the disciplines. No matter what it is, again, is subject to skepticism based on my perception and my understanding of what that particular thing, whatever it is mine. And it may be different than yours. And yours, we may correspond. We may agree that we have this in similarity, but still it separates itself and it belongs to you and it belongs to me in a different way. And it has to be that way. That's my worldview. And therefore, it causes a lot of, well, it just has all kinds of, we won't get in there right now, but that's the actual that's the understanding of postmodernism.
Well, it seems to create a great deal of consternation
Yeah.
in and of itself, just because everything is subjective to the individual. It's very individualistic. So when we look at anti-realism as being subjective, what happens to logic?
Well, that's a really good question, because logic in itself is a universal term. And here I go again, if I'm a postmodernist, and I have to do this all the time. I have to look at, you may agree that there's logic, but I say, you know what? There isn't. And I just am not going to adapt myself to that. I have problems with logic. I don't think that logic actually exists. In fact, logic could be a universal term that applies to everything or whatever in a thinking process, and it's going to be subject to my interpretation of it. And my interpretation, and again, follow this because this is really important, my interpretation is what counts.
Absolutely. I understand the interpretation of the individual is what counts. But when we look at terms such as anti-realism, and we delve into the philosophy of anti-realism, and we delve into self-actualization and the philosophy of what I believe to be true to me is all that matters, and logic is a subjective thought, where do we find responsibility?
Well, responsibility to that person could be accepted by me. I have to live in this world. I'm subject to everything about it, laws. I'm subject to all the things that we all go through. However, once again, I'm going to go back to this and say that it's subject to my interpretation. And
But
my
you've contradicted, the whole theory has contradicted itself by saying some things are subjective to me, but the laws and things are objective things. Those are things that hold me responsible to society.
I agree with that. That's a good point. However, I'm in the postmodernist way of thinking.
You
right
are
now,
in the
so
postmodernist
yeah,
way of
it's
thinking.
hard
So,
for me.
so help me understand where responsibility comes in, as far as obeying the laws of society.
Well, then I have to look at whatever you call responsible. If you want me to define the term of responsibility, I could say yes. That's a good definition of being responsible, and it might apply to that. But those are only words, and the word itself that you adapt to that word responsible. Here we go again in postmodernist thinking. I have to go and say that particular interpretation of responsibility that you have to that definition may not be mine. And I'm going to look at it in my own way. Yeah. There it is. Therein lies the conflict.
So everything, again, subjective, everything to your point of view, and everything to not being real philosophically. When we think of philosophy, we think of probably two main characters right off the top of my head. That would be Plato and Aristotle, and basically their philosophy was anything but postmodern.
Yes. Postmodernism is relatively new. Postmodernism, probably during Aristotle's time, Plato's time, if I can say this, I would say that postmodernism would be rejected. Because
Well, it's subjective because we're looking at things from a postmodernist point of view.
yeah, this is relatively new. This way, this thinking, this philosophy is relatively new. It's a rejection coming out of another part of history, modernism. We are in a postmodernistic age today.
And we want to be clear that postmodernism is a destructionist point of view according to Rorty and Derrida.
Derrida is the one that, of course, brought on deconstruction, and that term itself, what Derrida brought to this particular time. Derrida is considered, he is an intellectual, he's an academic. His principle of destructionism has changed the way that we look at anything that's been written, specifically anything literary, anything, I'm just going to say everything that's been written. And his whole principle of deconstruction looks at and takes looks at the author. Okay, the author. We come from an age, particularly right now, that the author creates the meaning. Derrida says no. You don't look at the author as creating a sense of whatever he is presenting in a sense of understanding and meaning that he's bringing forward. Itself, meaning is your interpretation of what he's saying. It's not the author's point. It's your point. And that whole sense of deconstruction is changing everything.
And when we come back, we're going to take a further look at the deconstructionism as well as a few other points in anti-realism and the philosophy of postmodernism. I'm Pete Denault, the host of Worldviews in Perspective. T. Nash, a Worldviews educator. Chris Stratton along with us, and this is a 406 media production. We'll be back with more on postmodernism coming up in just a moment.
Some changes in life are too painful to go through alone, and Cunningham Law can help in making difficult decisions from divorce to child custody. Kyle Cunningham focuses solely on family law. Cunningham Law will help you land on your feet when big changes come to your family and life. Visit www.familylawmontana.com or give Kyle a call at 406-203-4678 today. Cunningham Law Services. You don't have to go through this alone. Cunningham Law is a proud sponsor of the Northwest Regional Tournament.
Milk Crate Media 406 will be the home to a new group of local podcasts to highlight our great state of Montana and the people within it. Starting with a local show to promote Missoula sports athletes. Next, a podcast that will take a look at worldviews. Then a show that will entertain you while informing you about Montana's great outdoors. And finally, a podcast that will take a look at the people and places that make Montana great. Stop by mcratemedia.com to see the full line of new podcasts.
Advertising on the web can be intimidating. Where do you start? What is the most effective way to reach the audience you are targeting? Milk Crate Media can help you reach your audience, whether it is social media marketing or creating a unique commercial for streaming or for radio advertising. Milk Crate Media can help you build a new website or rebuild your existing website that will bring users back again and again. Visit www.mcratemedia.com today. Milk Crate Media is a proud sponsor of prep sports in Missoula and the surrounding valley.
Did your computer go down? Don't worry, Mike's Print and Copy has computer rentals available until you can get your computer replaced. In addition to computer rentals, Mike's has self-serve copiers so you can take care of your printing needs at your time. Do you have large-scale printing that needs to be done? From high-tech blueprints to large quantities, Mike's Print and Copy is your print store. Stop in and say hi to Mike at their new location at 1605 South Avenue West in Missoula. Mike's Print and Copy, proud sponsors of the Missoula Prep Sports Network.
Welcome back to Worldviews in Perspective, Milk Crate Media Production. I'm Pete Denault along with T. Nash, and Chris Stratton. T, of course, our Worldviews educator. I'm your host, and Chris is our producer and engineer, running the show for us each and every segment of the show. We're talking about postmodernism, discussing philosophy specifically today as a worldview discipline. And we've talked about the philosophy being anti-realism, which leads us into the autonomous point of view or autonomy of postmodernism. First, could you define autonomy from a postmodernistic definition?
Complete freedom.
Complete freedom. What is complete freedom to?
There are no chains that bind me or bound or cause me to be subject to.
So I'm going to go a little bit back into last segment where there are no chains to bind you or make you subject to. So responsibility being a subjective thing, logic being a subjective thing. Well, my point of view is a little bit different because of my worldview. I think freedom comes with a certain degree of responsibility, does it not?
I would say from your point of view, yes, that's probably true. There are responsibilities in freedom to yourself. What about society? To the earth? To what you live and have your being? How you live and have your being? There's a responsibility to that, yes. Postmodernism agrees with that. But in the sense of being tied to anything that I just talked about, is subject to my own interpretation. Again, we keep coming back to this and my interpretation of that. Because my interpretation is completely different than what you might think about all of that. Your sense of freedom, or your understanding of freedom from a worldview standpoint, is very different from mine.
Oh, absolutely. I would agree with that completely from a postmodernistic point of view. You are absolutely correct that your point of view and my point of view are completely different. And I suppose to some degree, my point of view is derived from your subjective look at the world.
Well, actually, from a postmodern standpoint, I think to clarify this a little bit more, that you come from a certain culture, and I do too. My culture might be different than your culture. Therefore, my truth and everything that's involved is determined. My culture determines truth. My culture determines me being autonomous or not being autonomous, whereas it would be in your culture, it could be very different.
Okay, you've used that example several times in the education of postmodernism, your culture as opposed to my culture. Help me understand your culture.
My culture that I live in actually creates me. My culture creates me. It also creates me, my identity and who I am, what I am. Pretty much everything about my life.
What is
my
culture,
belief
though?
system. Culture is a group, a community.
But isn't culture subjective in that group and community?
It's subjective and objective. And postmodernists, anything that's subjective is not going to be looked at. It's going to be taken. Anything that's subjective in your culture, and if it exists in mine, is not. It's going to be looked at from a critical standpoint.
Looking at that from a critical standpoint, what you just told me is somewhat contradictory.
Being contradictory, that's what you say, but I don't see that. If I'm a postmodernist, I'm not going to agree with that word. That's just a term. That's just a word.
It's just a word. So when...
And that word itself, the meaning, sorry to interrupt, but basically I know where you're going to go with this.
Okay, tell me.
Yeah, you're going to want some kind of definition of what is contradictive. Well, it's a word. Being contradictive has an objective sense to it. And I'm going to go, guess what? No, don't agree with that.
Okay, so help me understand the meanings of what is culturally acceptable and objective versus culturally unacceptable and subjective. Help me understand the the correlation between the two.
Well, the two words in my particular culture or community, if something is determined to be objective, it only applies to my culture. It doesn't apply to yours, unless there is unless we look at it and there's a parallel between the two. I suppose we could agree that that exists. But no, my whole sense of objectivity, of objective principles, that's probably what we're talking about, is objective principles, don't exist. And my culture might have a view, it might create something in that sense, and I would be part of that. That's part of my identity, based on my culture. You see that? You understand that? However, you live in a different culture, and even though we have a parallel sense, and you say objective, I can't agree with anything objective.
But you just told me that according to your culture, and according to the differences in my culture, those are objective points of view. So help me understand your culture so I can come full circle to understand how I can fit into your culture.
I don't think you would fit into my culture because your objective is your interpretation, and I might disagree with it. Mine's different. And that's okay. We're all the same, and they have equal justification. That's the other part of this. Your culture is equally justified as mine, and we are different. However, my culture has created me, and I live within that culture. Do you see how that works?
I'm trying to understand what your point of view of culture is.
Well, the word itself, culture, is a community. It is a way of life. I live within a culture. So do you. And my community is somewhat different than yours. It has to be.
So if your culture and your community created you, help me understand that.
That's what defines me. That's what defines me. Defines everything about me. In my autonomy, my freedom within that culture. Autonomy could be something that maybe there are chains that bind me. Based on my culture, and if that's true, whatever those things are, okay, that bind me, it could be a belief system, that there are aliens. It could all be anything. I'm just using that as an example. I agree with that. That's my culture. And it identifies who I am. You see how that works? That's my worldview. My worldview is created by my culture. Yet I interpret it as my own, which is going to be different than yours. And guess what? We're equally justified in our interpretations. Are you happy now?
Being equally justified in my interpretation and being fully autonomous and totally free, how does that affect ethics, the next discipline within the worldview?
Well, now you're jumping into ethics, and that's an excellent area to go to from a postmodernist standpoint. Ethics deals with morality. Wouldn't you agree that ethics is part of that?
It is.
And a sense of reason. It's part of that, too. A sense of coming to a reasoned conclusion.
And a behavior.
Well, in postmodernism, those things don't exist.
So as a core principle, ethics, it just doesn't
Why
compute.
should we have any? If there's no morality, why should there be any ethics? That's my statement to you.
Well, basically, if you have no ethics and no morality, how does society function? How does your community function? How do culturally does the community function?
If my culture adheres to that, any sense of morality, if you want to look at that, then my culture defines what that morality is. The word itself, morality, it's a universal term. I'm probably not going to look at that and accept it. I'm going to be skeptical of what you call morality. It's determined by my culture.
Well, I haven't touched on morality yet. You
Okay.
brought that up. Okay, so without really delving into morality, let's delve into ethics. Ethics is what is right and what is wrong. Is that correct?
That I understand that to be yes.
So philosophically, there's no right or wrong in your community?
Depends on the culture. They determine that. My culture determines that. So I guess I have to agree, yes, that those terms are true. There is a right and a wrong. However, that's subject, follow this with me, because I will look at that in a subjective way. And if my culture creates a difference between what is good and bad, and I'm going to interpret that to myself, which is what I'm going to do, that could be very different from your culture. And there we go.
So help me understand.
You're created by your culture. I'm created by mine. My culture defines who I am. That's where I find myself.
I understand ethically your culture creates who you are. Theologically, your culture creates who you are. Your whole being is created by community and culture. I understand that. Now, beings that ethically we've determined there is subjective right and subjective wrong. So, if I believe something to be subjective right and it takes advantage of your culture because I believe it to be right, that's okay.
Well, I might object to that because you could harm me.
But that's okay because it's my culture.
Well, in a sense of if we want to reason together, which I'm going to have a problem with, because I don't like reason. I don't trust it. But I would say yes, just for the sense of this discussion.
For the sense of this discussion, it's okay for one culture to take advantage of another.
No.
Subjectively.
No, I understand what you're saying, but yes, I would have to say yes to what you're saying. Yes. Let's just go with that.
Okay, so you're saying yes to that.
Mm-hmm.
What determines then what your morality may look like? Now we're going to talk about morality.
Whatever is defined in my culture is telling me what's right and wrong, or what morality is. And I don't really believe in a right and wrong. I don't believe in morality.
If there are no rights...
there is no morality because it's a universal term. It applies that morality applies to everybody, but I can't agree with that, and I'm really not going to subject myself to that.
So there's no morality within your community.
That's not true. You would have to talk to the other people.
I'm just asking the question.
Yeah. However,
I'm not making a statement.
You can make that observation about my community, but we probably would say, if we agree that there is no morality, no.
So we look at this from a perspective of there being no right, no wrong, no theology to speak of other than possibly atheism, not actual atheism, and not being able to define any right, wrong, or indifference. So how do we define what is socially
freedom.
acceptable?
Well, socially acceptable is what is determined by my community. And that itself is okay. That's correct. That would be something that I would adhere to because I'm created within that culture.
But isn't your culture at that point, and you as part of that culture, coming up with a definition of what that looks like for you and your community?
I think you're trying to trick me. I see what you're saying. It's a little bit complicated.
So are you not being contradictory in
No.
the words that you're choosing?
No. No, my meaning of the words of what you've described me so far are determined by me. And we could discuss whatever my determination and understanding what those words are. It's okay, we can do that.
Well,
You're looking at morality as a universal term. Morality applies to everyone. No, it doesn't. It doesn't apply to me. Being autonomous, that's what I'm seeking? Total complete freedom? Well, of course I am.
And I would ask what you're willing to achieve total and complete freedom.
Am I going to achieve it?
Is it
My-
just given to you?
If my culture allows it, yeah, we'll get there.
Is it freely given to you?
But being autonomous,
Yes.
that's a good question. I would say that, is it freely given? I don't know what you mean by given. Who gives it?
You would have to give it to yourself.
No, it's created. Autonomy is created by my culture.
Autonomy created by a culture that you can't define.
My culture defines everything. It's
So
defined.
tell me
Right.
what your culture is.
Well, my culture, in a postmodernistic standpoint, is my life. It's my particular time on this planet Earth, particularly right now, as I'm living it, in my culture.
There you have it. Philosophy covered in a postmodernistic point of view, and ethics as well. We'll be delving more into the 10 disciplines of postmodernism coming up in shows ahead. We're going to get into the politics and economics of postmodernism. I'm Pete Denault, your host, along with T. Nash, postmodernism instructor and educator, Chris Stratton. This is a Milk Crate Media production. Happy to have you along, and we will have more for you coming up in future episodes. Thank you for joining us. This is Worldviews in Perspective, a Milk Crate Media production. I'm your host, Pete Denault, encouraging you to join us as we explore the 6 predominant worldviews and the disciplines that make those worldviews what they are. We'll have educator T. Nash educating us to what the worldviews are and how they affect everyday society and our everyday lives. We'll be taking a historical look at worldviews with Dr. Lloyd Phillips, and we have Chris Stratton as our producer and also part of the show as well. Looking forward to giving you all the information possible on each and every worldview and each and every discipline, and drilling down so we can understand and communicate much more effectively with our differing worldviews as they affect us every single day in every action that we take. Please join us here for Worldviews in Perspective.